When I picked up the drop bracelet, he recognized it, even though I knew for a fact it belonged to a dead woman. The metal felt cold against my fingers, heavy and coarse, with an intricate engraving of intertwined snakes biting each other's tails, and that chill instantly seeped through my fingertips and into my veins, slowing my pulse to a painful thud. We stood in our perfect foyer, flooded with the sterile light of expensive lamps, and I watched Caleb's pupils contract into tiny black pinpricks, like a camera lens trying to focus on a threat. It lasted only a fraction of a second, a microscopic glitch in his flawless programming as the charming husband, but having grown up in a house where my father's mood could be predicted by the creak of a floorboard, I had learned to read such signals before I learned to read books. He smiled that soft, enveloping smile for which I had once traded my freedom, and casually remarked that it was just an old trinket of his mother's, lost ages ago. But I remembered the photograph from the police archive I'd accidentally seen on his forgotten tablet 3 months prior, the water-bloated wrist of a drowned woman and this exact bracelet, cutting into her pale skin. I placed the jewelry on the dresser, willing my hand not to tremble, a gesture that required more effort than my heaviest workout at the gym. The air hung heavy with the scent of his cologne, a blend of sandalwood, leather, and something elusively metallic that used to smell like success to me, but now reminded me of the sterility of a surgical table. Caleb stepped up behind me, his palms settling on my shoulders, warm, heavy, possessive, and began to knead my tense muscles, but there was no affection in the touch, only control, a physical inspection of just how tense I was, just how much I suspected. He asked what was for dinner in a voice so mundane I wanted to scream, but instead, I replied that I'd ordered takeout because I was tired. His fingers dug in for a second, just a little too hard, causing a dull ache, and he whispered in my ear that I was getting lazy, but he loved me anyway. In that moment, I realized he wasn't just lying, he was testing how deep I was willing to bury the truth to preserve the illusion of our happy marriage. Memories of how we met flooded back as I set the table, arranging plates with the geometric precision he demanded. 2 years ago, I was a broken, lost girl running from an ex-boyfriend's debts and my own insecurities, and Caleb had appeared like a rock in the middle of a storm, confident, wealthy, solving every problem with a single phone call. He surrounded me with care that initially felt like salvation, a warm blanket shielding me from a cruel world, but gradually that blanket began to suffocate, turning into a cocoon from which escape was impossible. I remembered how he smoothly severed ties with my friends, calling them losers who were dragging me down, how he insisted I quit my job because his woman shouldn't have to slave away for pennies. Now, watching him neatly, predatorily slice his steak, I saw not a savior but a jailer who had built a luxury cell and convinced the prisoner that outside the walls lay only death and chaos. But the most terrifying part wasn't the control, it was that somewhere deep down, I still wanted to believe the bracelet really belonged to his mother. All evening, I felt his gaze on me, sticky, examining, as if he were trying to x-ray me to find the exact point where doubt had taken root. We sat in the living room watching some mindless series, and every time I reached for my phone, he turned his head slightly, tracking the movement of my hands. The bracelet remained in the foyer, lying there like a small radioactive mine. We both knew of its presence, yet we pretended it didn't exist. I remembered the girl's name, Chloe, 24, architecture student, went missing 5 years ago, found 2 weeks later in the river. The official ruling was an accident, but on the forums I secretly read on a library computer, people wrote about strange bruising and the fact that her last boyfriend was an influential businessman whose name never made the press. Caleb was in construction back then, and his sights were right in that district, but my infatuation had blinded me to the connection before, while now, sheer animal terror kept me silent. That night, when his breathing became deep and even, I slipped out from under. In the morning, he acted as if nothing had happened, whistling a tune from an old movie and making coffee, the aroma mingling with the smell of burnt toast. I sat at the table, studying his perfectly shaven chin, wondering how many other mother's trinkets were hidden in our house. Caleb turned to me, mug in hand, his blue eyes shining with an unnatural, glassy kindness, and asked why I had slept so poorly, noting he'd felt me tossing and turning. It wasn't a question, it was a warning. He controlled even my sleep. He knew I had gotten up, he knew I had been searching. I smiled back with my most pathetic, apologetic expression and said I'd had nightmares about water, about a dark, cold river. His face froze for an instant, the mask cracking, but he immediately composed himself and suggested I see a therapist, one he would choose for me, because my nerves, he claimed, were completely shot. The next 3 days turned into an elaborate torture of unsaid things. He was emphatically caring, bringing flowers I hated and constantly touching me, as if marking his territory. I began my quiet, invisible war, turning into a shadow in my own home, tossing every corner while he was at work. I knew he was smart, sickeningly pedantic, and would never leave evidence in plain sight, so I didn't look in the safe or desk drawers. I checked ventilation grills, felt the linings of his winter coats, looked inside toilet tanks and behind the baseboards in the pantry. My heart hammered somewhere in my throat. The key was small and silver, likely for a P.O. box or perhaps a bank deposit box, but it had no number, only a strange scratch in the shape of the letters C. I photographed it with my secret phone, a cheap burner I'd bought with cash and hid in a box of tampons, the only place Caleb was too squeamish to look. I couldn't take the key, he would notice it was missing, his brain working like a... That evening, he came home earlier than usual, bringing with him the smell of rain and someone else's perfume, a faint, sweet, cheap scent that didn't match his status. He said he'd had a tough meeting with partners, but I noticed mud on his shoes, red, oily clay that you couldn't find in the city center where the offices were. That kind of clay was only found out of town, in the woods or at construction sites, and just looking at those reddish stains made me nauseous. I offered to clean his shoes, playing the perfect wife, and he accepted with lazy gratitude, not realizing he was handing me another piece of evidence. As I scraped the mud off over the sink, I carefully collected samples in a tissue, feeling like a character in a crime drama, only here the price of a mistake wasn't low ratings, but my life. Over dinner, he started talking about how it was time to think about children, that he wanted a big family, wanted the house filled with the sound of kids laughing. These words, which would have sounded like music coming from any other man, fell from his lips like stones sealing the entrance to a cave. I understood a child would be the final lock on my prison cell. A pregnant woman with an infant goes nowhere, she becomes totally dependent on him. I nodded, eyes lowered to my plate, picking at my salad while feeling a lump rise in my throat as he continued to map out our happy future, planning my life 20 years in advance. Suddenly he stopped and asked in an icy tone, "You're not taking pills behind my back, are you, Lana?" The question sounded like a gunshot, and I realized he was checking my things, counting the blister packs, controlling my fertility just as he controlled everything else. The next day, I decided on a desperate move. I drove to an address I found in Caleb's old tax documents hidden deep in a cloud storage account I'd cracked, knowing his obsession with dates. It was a storage unit facility on the outskirts of the city, a bleak place smelling of gasoline, rust, and hopelessness, a place where people like my husband never went. I found the specific unit. The rusty gates looked like they hadn't been opened in years, but the padlock was new, shiny, and expensive. The key I had seen in the office would fit this lock perfectly, I was 100% sure. I stood before the garage, listening to dogs barking in the distance, realizing that behind these doors lay a truth that could destroy me, but ignorance was even more terrifying. When I returned home, I found Caleb already there, sitting in the armchair in total darkness, still in his coat, staring at the front door. I froze on the threshold, feeling my heart drop into my heels, as he slowly, theatrically raised his hand and clicked on the floor lamp. The light hit my eyes, and I saw my secret phone on the coffee table, the one from the tampon box. It lay there, black and glossy like a death sentence, the screen glowing with the open photo gallery showing the key. Caleb didn't scream, didn't curse, he simply looked at me with an expression of deep, weary disappointment, the way one looks at a puppy that has peed on the rug and now has to be put down. "I thought we trusted each other," he said quietly, and in that silence, there was more threat than in the loudest scream. He made me sit across from him and began to speak, calmly, measuredly explaining that I was sick, that I was paranoid, that I was inventing enemies where there were none. He spoke so convincingly, so logically, that for a split second, I actually doubted my own sanity. Maybe I really was losing my mind. That was his greatest talent. He could rewrite reality, swap black for white, make you believe the sky was green and the grass blue. But then my gaze fell on his hand resting on the armrest, and I saw a thin, barely visible scratch on his wrist, fresh and red. A scratch that could only have been left by that bracelet with the sharp snake heads if it were hastily removed or put on. That small detail became the anchor that kept me from falling into the abyss of his manipulation. "You block my cards," I said, not asking but stating, because the notifications had stopped coming that morning. He nodded, not even trying to deny it, explaining it was a security measure so I wouldn't do anything stupid in my unstable condition. Now I was completely cut off from the world, no money, no communication. He had taken my main phone too, locked in an apartment with a man who had possibly killed several women. The social pressure compressed to the size of this room. To all our acquaintances, he was a saint, a martyr living with a hysteric, and I was the ungrateful wife. I realized if I started screaming or calling for help now, the neighbors would simply think I was having another episode, one Caleb had surely already warned them about. The night passed in a half-doze on the living room sofa because I refused to go to the bedroom, and to my surprise, he didn't insist, simply locking the door. I lay there staring at the ceiling, constructing a plan in my head, cold, cruel, the only one possible in my situation. I couldn't defeat him with force, couldn't outplay him legally, he had connections everywhere. But he had one weakness, his absolute certainty in his own superiority. He considered me broken, stupid, predictable, and that would be my weapon. I didn't need to run, I needed to make him believe he had won completely, so he would relax and make a mistake. In the morning, I walked into the kitchen, humble, shoulders slumped, and asked for forgiveness, saying that I probably really was going crazy from stress. I watched his ego inflate, saw him square his shoulders as he accepted my repentance, saw the spark of triumph in his eyes. He returned my main phone, saying he trusted my prudence, but I knew it now had tracking software installed. A week later, I found my moment when he went on a business trip for 2 days, a rare stroke of luck, a gift from fate. I didn't go to the storage unit, that would have been too obvious and dangerous. Instead, I went through his home archive, papers he kept in an old briefcase in the attic space. There, among contracts and bills, I found an old car insurance policy issued in Chloe's name, but with Caleb listed as the payer. It was a direct link, documentary proof of their relationship that he had forgotten to destroy, deeming the paper insignificant. I didn't steal the document, I made a copy, not on my phone, but by transcribing the data onto a slip of paper I sewed into the lining of my jacket. Now I had the name of an insurance agent who might know more. When Caleb returned, I arranged a romantic dinner, wore my best dress, and, most importantly, found a cheap bracelet in my jewelry box that looked vaguely like the snake one. I put it on my wrist. When he saw the jewelry, his face turned gray, his fork slipped from his fingers and hit the plate with a clatter. "Where did you get that?" he rasped, and for the first time, I heard genuine, animal fear in his voice. I blinked innocently and replied that I'd bought it at a kiosk in the subway because I just liked the design. He didn't believe me, he couldn't believe in coincidences. His paranoia, which he usually projected onto me, began to consume him. He decided I had found the stash, that I was toying with him, and it knocked the ground out from under him. Over the next few days, he was a wreck, twitchy, aggressive. He tore the house apart checking his hiding spots, and I could hear him cursing in his office. I poured oil on the fire with small details, leaving a web page open with news about discovered bodies, humming a song Chloe used to love. I learned this from her social media, preserved in a web archive. I was turning his life into the same gaslighting nightmare he had tormented me with, making him question reality. He started drinking, something he rarely did before, and in his drunken haze, his gaze became not just angry, but empty, dead. I knew I was walking on a knife's edge, that he might snap and hit me, or kill me, but I was ready. The climax came on Friday evening. He arrived drunk, reeking of whiskey and fear. He grabbed my arm, tearing off the cheap bracelet, and screamed, "You know. You know everything, you bitch." I didn't deny it. I looked him straight in the eye and said calmly, coldly, "I know about the storage unit. And the police know too. I sent them an anonymous tip with the geolocation and a photo of the key an hour ago." It was a lie, a risky, brazen lie, but it worked like a detonator. He went pale, shoved me aside so hard my back hit the wall, and rushed into his office to the safe to grab cash and documents. This was exactly what I was waiting for. While he was feverishly shoveling out cash, I slipped out of the apartment and locked the door from the outside with my key. The lock clicked, cutting off his exit. I knew he had a spare, but it would take seconds, precious seconds. I ran down the stairs, ignoring the elevator, dialing the police on the move, screaming into the phone that my husband was threatening to kill me, that he was armed, that there were drugs in the house, another small lie to speed up their reaction. When I ran out into the courtyard, I saw his shadow flit across the window of our apartment. He hadn't opened the door, he realized I had locked him in, and panic had seized him. The police arrived in 7 minutes, 7 minutes I spent hiding behind dumpsters, shivering from cold and adrenaline. They brought him out in handcuffs. He was screaming that I was crazy, that I had set it all up, but his deranged appearance, the money scattered around the apartment, and Chloe's real bracelet found in the safe, he had moved it there from the garage, I knew it, spoke for themselves. As they led him past me, he looked into my eyes, and I saw not hatred, but astonishment. He couldn't believe that he, the great manipulator, had been outplayed by his stupid, weak wife. I stood there, wrapped in a blanket given to me by a paramedic, and felt a hollowness spreading inside me, clean, ringing, and free. Epilogue. 8 months have passed. I live in another city, in a small apartment overlooking gray rooftops, working remotely under my maiden name. The investigation is moving slowly, new episodes and new victims are surfacing. The storage unit turned out to be a veritable crypt of evidence. Caleb writes me letters from jail, long, rambling things where he alternates between begging for forgiveness and threatening revenge, but I don't read them, I burn them immediately in the sink. Yesterday I bought myself a bracelet, a thin gold thread, barely visible on the skin, no stones, no snakes, no weight. I sit in a cafe, drinking coffee that I actually like, not the kind that was considered correct, and I look at my wrist. It feels light. And for the first time in years, it belongs only to me.